Nobody cried. That was the first thing people noticed. 43 people packed into St. Augustine's funeral home on a Thursday afternoon, black suits, black dresses, white handkerchiefs that never once touched a single eye, and not one tear. Not from the family. Not from the staff. Not even from the pastor, who had clearly been paid well enough to deliver a eulogy for a man he'd never met. Raymond Caldwell was dead, and the room felt less like a funeral and more like a waiting room. Like everyone had shown up not to say goodbye, but to find out what came next. The casket was mahogany, polished to the point where you could see your own reflection in it if you leaned close enough. Nobody leaned close. His 4 children sat in the front row, spaced apart in a way that said everything about their relationships without a single word being spoken. Marcus, the eldest, sat with his hands folded in his lap, back straight, face unreadable. Diane sat 2 seats away from him, jaw tight, eyes scanning the room like she was counting exits. Derek sat at the far end, leg bouncing under the pew, phone face down on his thigh. And then there was Caleb, sitting slightly apart from the others, not quite in the family row, not quite out of it. The half-brother, the one nobody talked about at Christmas. Behind them, a man in a charcoal gray suit sat alone in the 3rd row. He hadn't introduced himself to anyone. He hadn't offered condolences. He just sat there with a leather briefcase on his lap and watched. His name was Edmund Voss. He was Raymond Caldwell's attorney, and he had been watching this family for the better part of 20 years. The pastor said Raymond was a visionary, a builder, a man who understood that legacy was the only currency that outlasted death. Marcus almost laughed. He pressed his lips together and looked straight ahead instead. Visionary. That was one word for it. He could think of 7 others, none of them appropriate for a house of God. Diane leaned over slightly and whispered, "How long is this going to take?" Marcus didn't look at her. "As long as it takes. I have a flight at 6. Then you should have booked a later flight." She pulled back, said nothing else. Derek was staring at the casket now, something complicated moving behind his eyes. He'd flown in from Phoenix. Hadn't been back to Connecticut in 3 years. The last time he'd spoken to his father was over the phone, 14 months ago, a conversation that lasted 4 minutes and ended with Raymond telling him that disappointment had a face, and Derek was wearing it. He hadn't called back after that. Caleb sat with his hands pressed flat on his thighs, very still, very quiet. He was the youngest of the 4 by 7 years, the product of a relationship Raymond had kept hidden for most of a decade. He didn't share their last name. He hadn't grown up in their house. But Raymond had acknowledged him 3 years before his death, quietly, without ceremony, the way a man files a correction on an old document. And now, here Caleb was, sitting half inside the family row at Raymond Caldwell's funeral, not quite sure if he was allowed to grieve. The pastor wrapped up. People shifted. The low organ music faded. Edmund Voss stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the family. He moved slowly, deliberately, like a man who had nowhere to be and knew it. He stopped in front of Marcus first. "Mr. Caldwell?" He extended a hand. "Edmund Voss. I was your father's attorney for the past 18 years. Marcus shook it. "I know who you are." "Of course," Edmund nodded. Then he looked at each of them in turn. Diane, Derek, Caleb, the same measured look, the same slight inclination of the head. "I'll need all 4 of you at the estate tonight. 9 o'clock. Diane frowned. "Tonight? Can't the reading wait until—" "Your father was specific about the timing." Edmund said it pleasantly, like he was discussing a dinner reservation. 9 o'clock. The estate. All 4 of you present." He didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked back up the aisle, briefcase in hand, and was out the door before anyone thought to ask a follow-up question. The 4 of them stood there in the emptying funeral home, surrounded by fading flower arrangements and the smell of old wood and candle wax. Derek was the first to speak. "What was that about?" Nobody answered. Because nobody knew. But something in the air, something cold and specific, told all of them that tonight was not going to be a simple reading of a will. Raymond Caldwell had never done anything simply in his life. Why would he start now? The Caldwell estate sat 12 miles outside of Hartford, Connecticut, at the end of a private road that wasn't on any map app. You had to know it was there. A black iron gate, 2 stone pillars on either side, and a camera mounted at the top that had been recording everything that came and went for the past 11 years. Raymond had installed it himself. He liked knowing who was coming before they arrived. Marcus got there first. He always got there first. He sat in his car for a moment after pulling through the gate, engine idling, looking at the house through the windshield. 3 stories. 14 rooms. The kind of house that announced itself before you even stepped inside. Every light on the ground floor was on, warm amber bleeding through the tall windows into the dark outside. The staff had been here. Someone had prepared for this. He turned off the engine and got out. The air was cold. October in Connecticut had a particular kind of cold, not brutal yet, but deliberate. Like it was reminding you that winter was coming, whether you were ready or not. He rang the bell. A woman named Gloria, who had kept this house for 17 years, opened the door. She looked at Marcus with something close to sympathy, which immediately put him on edge. Gloria wasn't a sympathetic woman. She was efficient, precise, and emotionally unreadable. The fact that she looked at him with soft eyes meant something. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. "Come in." "The others?" "Not yet." He stepped inside. The foyer was exactly as he remembered it. Marble floors, high ceilings, a chandelier that cost more than most people's cars. A wide staircase curved up to the second floor. And at the far end of the hall, a door that had always been locked for as long as Marcus could remember. He glanced at it instinctively. Still locked. He'd asked his father about that room exactly once when he was 19. Raymond had looked at him the way he looked at people who asked questions he considered beneath him and said, "Some things aren't yours to know yet." Marcus had never asked again. He walked into the sitting room and waited. Diane arrived 20 minutes later, rolling a carry-on bag behind her, still dressed in her funeral clothes. She looked at Marcus, then at the room, then at the bar cart in the corner. "Please tell me that's stocked," she said. "Probably." She walked straight to it, poured 2 fingers of whiskey, and sat across from him. "Have you talked to Edmund?" "No." "Did he give you any indication of what this is about?" "No." She took a sip. "Raymond did everything for a reason. Whatever tonight is, it's not just a reading." "I know." "I'm just saying, Diane, I know." She looked at him for a moment, then looked away. That was the thing about Marcus and Diane. They'd grown up in the same house, eaten at the same table, survived the same father, and still managed to be strangers to each other in every way that counted. They communicated in short sentences and long silences and called it a relationship. Derek came in 40 minutes after that, smelling faintly of airport and something else Marcus chose not to identify. He dropped into a chair without greeting either of them and immediately picked up his phone. "No signal," he said, almost to himself. Marcus frowned. "What?" "No signal. My phone had full bars on the road. The second I pulled through the gate," Derek held the screen up. "Nothing." Diane checked hers. Her expression shifted slightly. "Mine too." Marcus checked his. "Same." He looked up at the ceiling briefly, then back down. "Old houses sometimes block." "This house is wired," Derek said flatly. "Raymond had the whole property fitted with boosters 6 years ago. I was here when he did it." He set his phone face down on the arm of the chair. "There's no signal because someone turned it off." The room went quiet. Gloria appeared in the doorway. "Can I get anyone anything? Coffee? Water?" "Who turned off the signal?" Derek asked. Gloria looked at him calmly. "Mr. Voss asked that the property remain private for the evening. It's a precaution." "A precaution against what?" "I'm sure Mr. Voss will explain everything when he's ready." She smiled the kind of smile that answered nothing. "Coffee?" Nobody answered her. She disappeared. They sat in silence for a moment, the 3 of them, and then Caleb walked in. He stopped just inside the doorway, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to come further. He was 26, lean, with Raymond's jawline and none of his confidence. He was wearing a dark jacket that was slightly too big for him, and he had the look of someone who had rehearsed what to say on the drive over and forgotten it all the moment he walked through the door. "Hey," he said. Diane looked at him. "Caleb." "Hey, Diane." He nodded at Marcus. "Marcus." Marcus nodded back. "You find the place all right?" "GPS cut out about a mile back. I just followed the road." "Sit down," Marcus said, not unkindly. "Just sit down." Caleb sat on the edge of the couch, closest to the door. He didn't take his jacket off. Derek hadn't looked up from his dead phone screen. "Derek," Caleb said. Derek looked up. Looked at Caleb for a moment with an expression that was hard to read. Not hostile, not warm, just assessing. Like he was trying to figure out what category Caleb belonged in. Then he looked back down. "Hey!" That was it. The 4 of them sat there in Raymond Caldwell's sitting room, surrounded by his furniture and his art and his silence. And the weight of everything unspoken between them filled the room like smoke. It was Diane who finally said what all of them were thinking. "Why are we all here together?" She set her glass down. "Raymond never did anything that brought all 4 of us into the same room. Not once. Not birthdays, not holidays, not when he was sick." She looked around at each of them. "So why now? Why tonight? Why does it have to be all 4 of us?" Nobody had an answer. "And that room," she said, quieter now, almost to herself, glancing toward the hallway. "The locked one." "What about it?" Caleb asked. "It's been locked my entire life. 29 years in and out of this house, and I have never once seen that door open." She paused. "Have you?" The question was directed at Marcus. He held her gaze. "No." She looked at Caleb. "You?" Caleb shook his head slowly. Diane picked her glass back up. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay." At exactly 9 o'clock, Edmund Voss walked into the room. He was carrying the same leather briefcase from the funeral. He set it on the coffee table in the center of the room, looked at each of them with that same measured expression, unhurried, unreadable, and sat down in the single chair at the head of the arrangement, like he'd planned where to sit in advance. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "We didn't exactly have a choice," Derek said. "You had a choice." Edmund looked at him evenly. "You chose to come. That matters." Derek opened his mouth, closed it.
Edmund clasped his hands together on top of the briefcase. "Before I open this, I want to be clear about a few things. What I'm about to read is a legally binding document, executed and witnessed in full compliance with Connecticut state law. Every clause has been verified. Every condition is enforceable." He paused. "I also want you to understand that your father was of completely sound mind when he drafted this. I was present. His physician was present. There is no grounds for contest on that basis." The room was very still. "Why are you telling us this before you've even opened it?" Marcus asked. Edmund looked at him. "Because your first instinct, after I read it, will be to question his mental state. A beat. I want to save us all some time." He unlatched the briefcase. He removed a single document, sealed in a dark envelope with Raymond Caldwell's personal wax seal pressed into the back. He broke it carefully, unfolded the pages, and smoothed them against his knee. He looked up one more time. "Are you ready?" Nobody said yes. Nobody said no. Edmund began to read. "I, Raymond Arthur Caldwell, being of sound mind and full legal capacity, hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, superseding all prior versions. To my children, Marcus, Diane, Derek, and Caleb, I leave the following." He read through the opening clauses steadily. The properties, the accounts, the holdings. The numbers were staggering, even for people who had grown up knowing Raymond was wealthy. 42 million in liquid assets. 3 properties in Connecticut, 1 in Miami, 1 in Colorado. Shares in 2 private companies. A collection of art. A warehouse in New Haven that none of them knew existed. Diane's grip tightened on her glass. Derek had gone very still. Marcus watched Edmund's face more than he listened to the words. Caleb sat with his hands pressed flat on his knees, barely breathing. And then Edmund paused. He turned the page, and his voice, which had been steady and professional up to that point, shifted, not dramatically, not with any performance. Just a single, almost imperceptible drop in tone. Like a man reading something he had memorized but still found remarkable. "However," Edmund said, "the above assets will not be distributed in equal shares. They will not be distributed at all, until one condition is met." The room didn't move. "Only one of you will inherit everything." Silence. Real silence. The kind that has weight to it. And to determine who, Edmund turned to the next page. "A choice must be made. By all of you. Together." He looked up, for faces stared back at him. He held their gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then he looked back down at the document and kept reading. Edmund let the silence sit for a moment before he continued. He didn't rush it. He didn't look up to gauge their reactions. He just turned the page with the same deliberate calm he'd carried into the room and kept reading. The estate, assets, properties, and holdings listed above, totaling in excess of $42 million, will pass in full to one individual among my 4 children. That individual will be determined not by birth order, not by proximity, not by any measure I have chosen. They will be determined by a choice made collectively, by all 4 of my children, within 72 hours of this reading. Marcus said, "What does that mean, collectively?" Edmund held up one finger. "Not dismissively. Just wait. The choice must be unanimous. All 4 must agree. If even one refuses to participate, or if the 72 hours expire without a decision, the entirety of the estate will be liquidated and donated. Every account emptied, every property sold, every asset dissolved. Nothing will remain for any of you." Derek laughed. It wasn't a real laugh. It was the kind that comes out when the brain can't process what it's hearing and needs somewhere to put the pressure. "This is insane," he said. "This is genuinely insane." Edmund kept reading. "The choice you must make is this: one among you must be offered. Not symbolically, not metaphorically. One of you must be willing to give up your claim, your future, and your presence among the living, so that the others may inherit what I have built. The room went cold. Diane set her glass down on the table. The sound of it was very loud. One of you, Edmund continued, his voice the same steady instrument it had always been, must be chosen as the sacrifice. That person must present themselves willingly, at the location specified in the attached document, before sunrise on the third day. If this condition is met, the remaining 3 inherit everything, split as I have designated. If it is not met, he turned the final page. Everything burns. He folded the document. He set it on the coffee table. He looked at them. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The fire in the hearth crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Somewhere deeper in the house, a clock ticked. Then Diane said, very quietly, "Read that again." "I don't think that's necessary." "Read again." Edmund looked at her steadily. "You heard it correctly the first time, Miss Caldwell. He can't do this." Diane stood up. "This isn't legal. You cannot put a condition like that in a will. You cannot." "I told you before we began," Edmund said, "that this document has been fully verified. Every clause, every condition." "By who?" "By you? You work for him. You worked for him." "By 3 independent attorneys and a Connecticut probate judge who reviewed and approved the terms 14 months ago." That stopped her. She stood there, hand on the back of the couch, and stared at him. "A judge approved this. The condition doesn't specify the manner of sacrifice. It doesn't instruct violence. It states that one individual must present themselves willingly at a designated location before a designated time. What happens after that presentation is outside the scope of the document." "What does that mean?" Caleb asked. His voice was low. It was the first time he'd spoken since Edmund started reading. Edmund looked at him. "It means the document is careful. Deliberately so." "Careful," Marcus repeated. He said it like the word tasted wrong. He'd been sitting completely still since Edmund finished reading. Spine straight, hands folded, face controlled. But his eyes were doing something different. They were moving, calculating. "He planned this. He sat down with you, with lawyers, with a judge, and he planned every word of this." "Yes." "How long ago?" 2 years before his death." Marcus nodded slowly, like a confirmation of something he'd already suspected. "And you've known this whole time, every time we spoke, every time I called you with questions about his estate." He looked at Edmund directly. "You knew." Edmund met his gaze. "I was bound by attorney-client privilege." "Don't hide behind privilege right now." "I'm not hiding. I'm explaining." Edmund's voice didn't rise. It never rose. "Your father was my client for 18 years. I served him. What he put in that document, whether I agreed with it or not, was not mine to reveal." "Do you?" Derek asked sharply. "Agree with it?" Edmund paused. "Just barely. What I think is irrelevant." "That's not an answer." "No," Edmund said. "It isn't." Diane walked to the window. She stood with her back to the room, arms crossed, looking out at the dark. Her reflection was faint in the glass. A ghost version of herself staring back at her from the outside. 72 hours, she said. "Starting from the moment I finished reading," Edmund confirmed. "Which means you have until 9:17 p.m. on Saturday." "And if we just leave?" Derek asked. "Right now, all 4 of us. We walk out, we go home, we let it burn." "What happens then?" "Then the liquidation process begins automatically. It's already structured. The accounts will be frozen Monday morning regardless of the outcome. If the condition is met before Saturday, the freeze becomes a transfer. If not," he opened his hands. "Dissolution. $42 million, Derek said, more to himself than anyone else. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth and stared at the floor. 42 million. 42,300,000 and change, Edmund said. As of last quarter. And the properties. 5, plus the warehouse. Derek looked up. What's in the warehouse? That information becomes available to the heir upon transfer. Of course it does. Derek stood up and pushed both hands through his hair. Of course. Marcus was watching Caleb. Caleb hadn't moved. He was still sitting on the edge of the couch with his hands on his knees, and he was looking at the floor with an expression Marcus couldn't fully read. Not panic. Not anger. Something quieter and more complicated than either of those. Caleb, Marcus said. Caleb looked up. What are you thinking? A pause. I'm thinking that this feels like something he designed specifically for us. Not just the condition. All of it. The timing, the location, the fact that it's unanimous. He looked around at each of them. He knew exactly how each of us would react to this. He's been studying us our whole lives. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Diane turned from the window. So what do we do? Nobody answered immediately. Edmund reached into the briefcase again and produced 4 smaller envelopes. He set them on the coffee table, one in front of each position. These are for you individually. Your father wrote each of you a personal letter, separate from the will. He asked that you read them tonight, privately. Marcus looked at his envelope. His name was written on the front in Raymond's handwriting. Precise, angular, the letters slightly too large. He recognized it instantly. He'd seen it on birthday cards that arrived without warmth, on letters that felt more like assessments than correspondence. He didn't pick it up. There's one more thing, Edmund said. He reached into the briefcase a final time and produced a single key, old, iron, slightly tarnished, and set it in the center of the table. All 4 of them looked at it. The locked room, Marcus said flatly. Your father's instruction was that it be opened tonight. Together. Edmund stood. I'll leave you to it. You're leaving. Diane turned from the window. You're just going to drop all of this on us and leave? I'll be in the study at the end of the hall. If you have legal questions, I'm available. He picked up his briefcase. But what happens in this room from this point forward is between the 4 of you. That was your father's explicit wish. He looked at them one last time, that steady, observant gaze. You have 72 hours. He walked out of the room. His footsteps crossed the marble foyer. A door opened and closed. And then there were 4. For people in a room with a fortune they couldn't touch, a condition they couldn't believe, a key to a room none of them had ever entered, and 4 letters written by a dead man who had somehow managed to control the room he was no longer in. Derek picked up the key, turned it over in his fingers. So, he said, who's going first? The locked room was at the end of the east hallway, past the family portraits and the grandfather clock that had stopped working sometime in the 90s and never been fixed. Raymond had kept it there anyway. He liked things that didn't move. Derek led the way with the key. The others followed, Marcus behind him, then Diane, then Caleb, who stayed a half step back from the group the way he always did, close enough to belong, far enough to escape if he needed to. The key turned with a sound like something exhaling. The door swung open. Derek reached inside and found the light switch. A single overhead bulb came on, warm and slightly yellow, and what it revealed was not what any of them expected. It was an office. Small, sparse, nothing like the rest of the house. No artwork. No expensive furniture. Just a desk, a filing cabinet, a corkboard on the wall covered in photographs and handwritten notes connected by red string, and a single chair facing the desk. Marcus stepped inside first. He stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, taking it all in. The photographs on the corkboard were of them. All 4 of them. Different ages, different stages of life. Marcus at his college graduation. Diane at a business conference, her name badge visible, her expression unguarded in a way that meant she hadn't known the photo was being taken. Derek outside an apartment building Marcus didn't recognize. Caleb in what looked like a parking lot, talking on the phone. Surveillance photos. Diane made a sound low in her throat. He was watching us. He was always watching us, Marcus said quietly. There were notes beside each photograph. Handwritten observations in Raymond's angular script. Marcus leaned in close to read the one beside his own photo. Disciplined. Controlled. Will try to manage the situation. Won't show fear. That's his weakness. He'll sacrifice everything to appear strong. His jaw tightened. He straightened up and said nothing. Diane found hers. She read it. Whatever it said. She folded the edge of the paper down over it and stepped back from the board without sharing it. Derek found his. He read it, laughed once. That same pressurized laugh from earlier, and turned away. "Okay," he said. "Okay. I've seen enough." Caleb was standing in front of his own photograph, reading the note beside it. He read it twice. Then he looked at the others. "He wrote about all of us," Caleb said. "But look at the dates on the photos." They looked. The most recent photographs were dated 8 months ago. 3 months before Raymond's diagnosis became serious. He'd been doing this systematically, recently, deliberately. "He wasn't just watching us," Caleb said. "He was preparing." "Preparing for what?" Diane asked, though her voice suggested she already knew. "For this," Caleb said. "For tonight. For everything that's about to happen between us." The room was quiet. Then Derek said, "I'm not doing it." Everyone looked at him. "The condition, whatever this sacrifice thing is supposed to mean, I'm not doing it. None of us should do it. We should all just walk out of here right now and let the whole thing go." He looked around at each of them. $42 million is not worth whatever this is. "Easy to say," Diane said. "I mean it." Marcus was very still. "He's still running the experiment," Caleb said quietly. "He's just not here to watch it." Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Derek turned from the window. His expression had changed. The agitation was still there, but underneath it now was something colder and more deliberate. "Okay," he said. "So we're talking. We're being honest." He looked around the room. "Then let's ask the real question." "Don't," Marcus said. "We have to eventually. Not tonight." "When, Marcus?" "Tomorrow night. Saturday morning at 8:59. Derek looked at each of them. "If we're going to have this conversation, let's actually have it. Who, out of the 4 of us," he stopped, seemed to catch himself, then pushed through, "contributes the least? Who, if they were gone, would leave the smallest hole?" The room temperature dropped. Diane looked away. Caleb didn't move. Marcus stood up slowly. "Derek, I'm just asking the question that everyone is already thinking." "No one is thinking that." "Everyone is thinking that." Derek's voice was flat now. "Certain. You've all been thinking it since Edmund closed that document. You're just waiting for someone else to say it first so you don't have to be the one who said it." He looked at Marcus directly. "I said it. So now what?" Marcus held his gaze for a long moment. "Now we go to bed," he said quietly. "And we don't say another word tonight that we can't take back." He walked out of the room. Diane followed a few seconds later without looking at anyone. Derek stood alone in the center of the room, the dying fire behind him, his drink in his hand. Caleb was the last one there. He stood up slowly, picked up his personal envelope from the table, the one with his name in Raymond's handwriting, and turned it over once in his hands. He looked at Derek. "He knew you'd say that," Caleb said quietly. "He wrote it in your note. I could see it from where I was standing." Derek stared at him. "What did it say?" Caleb tucked the envelope into his jacket pocket. "Read yours," he said. "Then we'll talk." He walked out. Derek stood alone in the room. The fire was nearly out now. He looked at his envelope on the table, his name in his dead father's handwriting, and for a long time he didn't move. Then he picked it up. He broke the seal. He started to read. And whatever was in that letter, whatever Raymond Caldwell had written to his most volatile child in the full knowledge that he would be dead before it was read, it changed Derek's face completely. The agitation drained out. The cold calculation drained out. What replaced it was something rawer and older than either of those things. He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully, pressed it flat against his chest for just a moment, and set it back down on the table. He poured another drink. He didn't sleep that night. If the story has you gripped, hit that like button. You won't want to miss what happens next. Friday morning came gray and quiet. The kind of morning that doesn't announce itself. No sun, no dramatic shift in the sky. Just a slow bleed from black to dark blue to the color of old ash. And suddenly it was day without feeling like it. Marcus was already awake when the light changed. He hadn't really slept. He'd lain on top of the covers in one of the guest rooms with his shoes still on and his eyes on the ceiling, running calculations in his head the way he always did when something was wrong. Not about the money, about the people, about the four of them in this house and what the next 48 hours were going to do to whatever was left of their relationships. He'd read his letter sometime around 2 in the morning. He hadn't slept after that. He came downstairs at 6:30 to find Caleb already in the kitchen, sitting at the counter with a cup of coffee and his personal envelope open on the counter in front of him. He'd clearly read it multiple times. The paper was slightly creased from handling. Marcus poured himself a cup and sat across from him. They didn't speak for a while. Just two men and coffee and the sound of the house settling around them in the early morning. Eventually Marcus said, "How much do you know about our father? The real version." Caleb wrapped both hands around his mug. "More than you think. Less than you probably want to hear. Tell me." Caleb looked at him carefully. "My mother knew Raymond for 11 years before she told me who he was. She wasn't protecting him. She was protecting me." He paused. "He wasn't a good man, Marcus. I think you know that. But the version of him that you saw, the controlled, disciplined, successful version, that wasn't the whole picture. What was the rest of it? A man who needed to own things. Not just businesses, people, relationships. He needed to know that everything around him was structured exactly the way he designed it." Caleb looked down at his mug. "My mother left because she figured out that she was part of the structure. Not a person to him. A piece." He looked up. "I think that's what this will is. One last piece of the structure. Even after he's gone, everything moves the way he built it to move." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "What did your letter say?" "It said he was proud of me." Caleb said it without emotion, which somehow made it heavier. First time he'd ever said it. In a letter, after he was already dead. He turned the envelope over. "Yours?" Marcus looked at his coffee. "He told me I was the only one he trusted, that he built everything with me in mind." A pause. "Then he said that trusting me meant believing I'd make the hard choice when it was necessary." Caleb absorbed that. "He was pointing you toward someone." "Yes." "Who?" Marcus didn't answer. Caleb studied him. "Marcus, who did he point you toward?" Before Marcus could respond, they heard footsteps on the stairs. Quick, purposeful footsteps that could only belong to one person. Diane walked into the kitchen already dressed, hair pulled back, looking like she'd had exactly enough sleep to be dangerous. She looked at both of them, registered the open envelopes. "You've read yours, have you?" Marcus asked. She poured coffee without answering. Then she turned and leaned against the counter and looked at Marcus with an expression that was almost clinical. "He told me to trust you," she said. "Did he tell you to trust me?" A beat. "No," Marcus said. Something moved across Diane's face. "There and gone." "That's what I thought." She took a sip of coffee. "He told me to trust you, Marcus. Specifically. He said that when it came down to the final decision, you would know what needed to be done and I should follow your lead." She set the mug down. "And then he told me one other thing." "What?" She looked at him steadily. "He told me Derek was the weakest link." The kitchen went very quiet. Caleb set his mug down slowly. "He used those words?" Marcus asked. "He said, and I'm quoting directly, Derek has always been the one most likely to collapse under pressure. He is also the one whose absence would cost the family the least." She held Marcus's gaze. "He was telling us who to choose." "He was manipulating you," Caleb said quietly. "He was manipulating all of us. Through the letters." "Maybe," Diane said. "But he wasn't wrong about Derek. That's not the point." "The point," Diane said, turning to Caleb with a patience that had an edge to it, "is that we have less than 48 hours, $42 million on the line, and a condition that requires all four of us to agree. I am trying to figure out how to make that happen." She looked back at Marcus. "And I think you are too." whether you want to admit it or not. Marcus said nothing. So let me ask you directly, Diane continued, because we are running out of time for indirectness. She looked at her brother. Are you in? The question landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Marcus looked at her, then at Caleb, then at his coffee cup. He turned it slowly in his hands. I need to think, he said. Think fast, Diane said. She picked up her mug and walked out of the kitchen. Derek came down at 9. He looked like a man who had spent the night wrestling with something and lost. Eyes red at the edges, jaw unshaved, wearing the same clothes from the night before. He poured coffee, drank half of it standing at the counter, and then looked at Marcus, who was still sitting where he'd been for the past 2 hours. I know what Diane is doing, Derek said. Marcus looked up. What do you mean? I mean, I'm not stupid, Marcus. I know how she thinks. I know how this works. He set the mug down. She read her letter and now she's working an angle. That's what Diane does. She finds the angle and she works it. He looked at his brother directly. Did she talk to you this morning? A pause. Yes, Marcus said. And we talked. About me. It wasn't a question. Marcus held his gaze and didn't deny it. She shared what her letter said. Derek nodded slowly, like a man having a suspicion confirmed. Raymond told her I was the weak one, didn't he? Still not a question. He told her I was the logical choice. Derek. Just say yes or no. Yes. Derek laughed. That same pressurized sound. He picked up his mug, looked into it, set it back down. You know what the funny thing is? He said the same thing to me about her. He looked up. My letter. He told me Diane was volatile, financially reckless, and that her instability would eventually destroy anything she inherited. He tilted his head. He was playing us against each other. From the grave. Caleb walked in from the hallway. He'd clearly been listening. He didn't pretend otherwise. He just leaned in the doorway and said, That's exactly what he was doing. And it's working. Derek looked at him. So what do? We stop reading his letters as instructions, Caleb said. We start reading them as data. He told each of us something designed to point us toward a specific person. That tells us something about his psychology, about his strategy, but it doesn't have to tell us what to do. That's a nice idea, Derek said. But we still have a clock running. I know. And we still need to make a choice. I know that too. So, Derek opened his hands. What's your actual suggestion, Caleb? Because you keep pointing out the problem without offering a solution. Caleb was quiet for a moment. My suggestion is that we stop letting him run this. We put the letters away. We sit down together, all 4 of us, and we have an honest conversation about what we actually want to do, not what he designed us to do. Derek considered this. Then he nodded. Fine. Where's Diane? They found her in the library. She was sitting in a leather chair with her phone in her hand, staring at the screen even though there was still no signal. An old habit, checking a phone that couldn't connect to anything. She looked up when the 3 of them walked in. She looked at Derek first. Something shifted in her expression. Not guilt exactly, more like a recalibration. She'd expected to control the timing of this conversation, and she hadn't. Sit down, Marcus said. She didn't move. I'm already sitting. Diane. She looked at him. Then she set her phone face down on the arm of the chair and waited. Marcus stayed standing. We know what the letters said. All of us. He wrote each of us something designed to point us toward someone else. He was trying to build consensus through manipulation rather than conversation. He looked around the room. So we're going to have the conversation he didn't want us to have. Directly. All 4 of us. Silence. Okay, Diane said carefully. What conversation is that? Whether we're actually considering this, Marcus said. Not abstractly. Not hypothetically. Actually. Because I think some of us have moved past the denial stage and I want to know where everyone stands. Derek looked at Diane. Are you? She held his gaze. Am I what? Considering it. A long pause. Long enough to be its own answer. Then she said, I'm considering the situation. I'm considering what $42 million means and what losing it means. I'm considering all of it. She looked around. And I think every single one of you is doing the same thing. So let's stop pretending otherwise. The room held that for a moment. Then Derek said quietly, with a kind of exhausted honesty that had none of his earlier performance in it, I can't be the one chosen. I want to be straight with you about that. Whatever else happens, I can't. I have people depending on me. People who will be in serious danger if I disappear. He looked at each of them. I'm not saying that to protect myself. I'm saying it because you deserve to know my position. We all have people depending on us, Diane said. Not like this. Derek. Not like this, Diane. His voice was very flat, very certain. So whatever conversation we're having, that's my position. I needed you to know it. Caleb said. Then who? The question dropped into the room like a stone into still water, and the ripples went everywhere. Nobody answered. Nobody answered for a long time. And then Diane looked at Caleb. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't point. She didn't accuse. She just looked at him with that clinical, analytical gaze of hers, and let the look carry the weight of everything she wasn't saying. Caleb saw it. His expression didn't collapse. It did something more complicated than collapse. It closed, like shutters coming down over a window. He looked at Diane, then at Derek, then at Marcus. Marcus was looking at the floor. Marcus, Caleb said. Marcus looked up. Look at me. Marcus looked at him. Are you seriously considering this? A pause that was 3 seconds long and felt like 3 years. I'm considering everything, Marcus said quietly. Something broke in the room. Not loudly. Not with any drama. Just a clean, quiet fracture. The sound of trust going. Caleb stood up. He wasn't shaking. His voice when he spoke was completely controlled, which somehow made it worse. I am the only one in this room who didn't grow up in this house. I am the only one who didn't benefit from what Raymond built. I spent my entire childhood without a father, without his name, without any of what you all had access to. He looked around the room. And now you're sitting here looking at me like I'm the logical answer. Because I'm the outsider. Because I'm the one who fits the least neatly. Caleb, Marcus started. Don't. The word was quiet and absolute. Don't manage me right now. I'm not one of your situations to manage. He walked to the door. Caleb, Diane's voice, not cold, almost something like remorse. We haven't decided anything. He stopped in the doorway. He didn't turn around. You decided the moment you looked at me like that. He walked out. The three of them sat in the silence he left behind. Derek was staring at the floor. This is wrong, he said quietly. What we just did, whatever that was, it was wrong. We didn't do anything, Diane said, but her voice had lost its certainty. We looked at him, Diane. We sat here and we looked at him and we let him read it. He looked at her. That's something. That's not nothing. Marcus stood up abruptly. He walked to the window. Outside, the sky was the color of concrete. The trees were bare. The gate at the end of the driveway was still closed. He pressed one hand flat against the glass. He designed this perfectly, he said, more to himself than anyone else. Every single piece of it. The letters, the locked room, the photographs, the unanimity clause. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, older than he felt, tighter around the eyes. He knew exactly what we'd do. He knew who we'd look at. He knew the order we'd break in. He turned. We're doing exactly what he built this to make us do. Then what do we do instead? Diane asked. The answer didn't come, because at that moment, from somewhere deeper in the house, they heard it. A door, then footsteps, then Caleb's voice, low, urgent, talking to someone. All three of them stood up. Marcus moved first out of the library and down the hall toward the sound. Diane and Derek followed. They rounded the corner near the east hallway and stopped. Caleb was standing outside the locked room. The door was open again, somehow, and he was talking to Edmund Voss, who was standing in the doorway of the study at the far end of the hall with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up and an expression on his face that, for the first time all weekend, wasn't entirely composed. Caleb saw them. He stopped talking. Edmund looked at the three of them. Then he looked at his watch. "You have 31 hours," Edmund said. He picked up his jacket from the back of the study chair. "I'd suggest you use them wisely." He closed the study door. Caleb turned to face the three of them in the hallway, and Marcus looked at his half-brother. This man he barely knew, who shared his blood but not his name, who had been dropped into the center of this designed catastrophe through no fault of his own, and he felt something he hadn't let himself feel since he'd walked into this house. "Shame." "Caleb," he said, "come back to the room. All of us. Right now." Caleb looked at him for a long moment, searching for something in his face. Whatever he found there, or whatever he decided to believe was there, made him nod once. They walked back together. And this time, when they sat down, no one looked at anyone the way Diane had looked at Caleb, because Marcus had stopped it. Or so he believed. Still watching? Good, because the truth hasn't come out yet. Like this video, and stay locked in for the final act. Saturday came in like a held breath. No wind, no rain, just a flat, colorless sky pressing down on the estate like a lid on a jar. 31 hours had become 14. 14 had become 6. And now, at just past 3 in the afternoon, with the sun already beginning its early descent behind the tree line, they had less than 6 hours left. They'd spent most of Saturday in the same room, not talking mostly, just existing in proximity to each other the way people do when they've run out of things to say but aren't ready to separate. Gloria had brought food at some point, sandwiches, fruit, coffee, and it had sat largely untouched on the table. Nobody had much of an appetite. The letters were still there. All 4 of them, some open, some refold, sitting on the coffee table like evidence. Marcus had barely moved from his chair in hours. Diane had gone through the bar cart twice and switched to water somewhere around noon. She sat with her legs pulled up beneath her, staring at the fire that Gloria had rebuilt that morning, and said very little. Derek had paced. Saturday. Paced again. At one point he'd gone outside and stood in the cold for 20 minutes before coming back in without explanation. Caleb sat apart from the others, not in the hostile way from the day before, just separate. Thinking. He had a stillness to him now that felt different from his earlier quietness. Less like withdrawal, more like arrival. Like a man who had figured something out and was waiting for the right moment to say it. At 3:17 he said it. "I need to tell you something about my mother." The room shifted attention toward him without anyone visibly moving. She met Raymond in 1989. She was 23. He was 31, already building the company, already becoming what he became. Caleb kept his eyes on the middle distance, not looking at any of them specifically. She said the thing about him that nobody understood from the outside was that he wasn't cruel in the way most cruel people are. He didn't lose his temper. He didn't shout. He was never violent. A pause. He was just structuring everything. Always. Every relationship, every conversation, every situation had a role for each person to play, and he decided the roles before anyone else sat down at the table. Marcus was very still. "My mother left when I was 2, Caleb continued. "But before she left, she found something. In his office. Not this office, the one he had at the company. A file." He looked at his hands. It was a file on her. Observations, assessments, behavioral notes going back to the beginning of their relationship. He'd been documenting her the way you document a subject in a study. Her patterns, her triggers, her weaknesses. He finally looked up. She said it was the most frightening thing she'd ever read. Not because of what was in it, but because of how clinical it was. There was no feeling in it anywhere. Just data. Diane had unfolded her legs and was sitting forward now. "He did the same thing to us," she said quietly. "The corkboard." "Yes." Caleb nodded. "But here's what I've been sitting with since last night." He leaned forward, elbows on knees, and looked at each of them in turn. "My mother kept a copy of that file. She took it when she left because she knew one day she might need it. She gave it to me 3 years ago when Raymond acknowledged me publicly. She said, and I'm going to tell you her exact words. She said, 'If he's bringing you in, it's because he wants something. Find out what it is before it finds you.' The room was absolutely silent. I read that file cover to cover, Caleb said. And then when Raymond acknowledged me, I started paying attention to him the way he'd always paid attention to everyone else. Watching, documenting. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper. Not an envelope, just a sheet of paper, folded in thirds, covered in handwriting. I found his accountant 8 months ago, not Edmund, his private accountant, a man named Stuart Reeves who Raymond had been paying off the books for 11 years. Derek sat up straight. Off the books for what? Caleb unfolded the paper. Raymond started liquidating the estate 2 years ago. Quietly, methodically, moving assets into accounts that aren't in the will, into holdings that don't exist in any document Edmund has. He looked at the paper. The 42 million Edmund read to us, that's what's left. The visible portion. The amount he was willing to put in the will. He looked up. He moved the rest. Before he died. How much rest? Marcus asked. His voice was very controlled. Stuart estimated somewhere between 60 and 80 million. Moved over a period of 18 months into accounts in 3 different countries. Caleb refolded the paper. It's gone. Not liquidated and donated, just gone. Hidden. Inaccessible. Probably to people and institutions none of us will ever be able to trace. The fire popped. Nobody moved. So the 42 million, Diane said slowly. That's real. That exists. Yes. But it's a fraction of what he actually had. Yes. And he hid the rest before he died. She stared at Caleb. Why? Why would he do that? Caleb set the paper on the table. Because this, he gestured around the room, at the house, at all of them, was never about the money. Silence. Say that again, Derek said. This was never about the money, Caleb repeated. The 42 million is real and it's available and one of us could theoretically inherit it. But that was never the primary purpose of the will. He looked at each of them. The primary purpose was this. Right here. The 4 of us in this house for 72 hours under pressure, with everything on the line. Making choices we'd never make in ordinary life. He paused. He wanted to see what we'd do. Who we'd become. What we were actually made of when the structure fell away. Marcus made a sound that wasn't quite a word. He stood up and walked to the window. He stood there with his back to the room, and his shoulders were doing something they almost never did. Something that looked, from behind, like they were working hard to hold a shape. He's been dead for 4 days, Marcus said. And he's still the most powerful person in this room. Nobody argued with that. Derek stood up. He walked to the center of the room and stood there, hands in his pockets, and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at all of them. Okay, he said. Okay, so let's say you're right, Caleb. Let's say this whole thing is a psychological experiment. A final test. Whatever. He dropped his hands to his sides. We still have a choice to make. Because that 42 million is real. And the deadline is real. And whatever the reason Raymond built this, the condition is still sitting there. The condition is designed to make us fail, Caleb said. What do you mean? Think about it. Caleb stood now too, the paper in his hand. The unanimity requirement. Why unanimous? Why not 3 out of 4? Why not majority rules? He looked around. Because he knew unanimous was nearly impossible. He knew one of us would refuse. He built in the failure condition deliberately because he didn't want any of us to inherit. He wanted to watch us fracture. He looked at Marcus's back. And we almost did exactly that. Yesterday afternoon, in this room, we almost did exactly what he designed us to do. Marcus turned from the window. His face was composed again, but something behind it had shifted. Something had settled. The one who refuses, he said quietly. Caleb looked at him. What? Edmund said it. The night of the reading. Marcus walked back toward the group slowly. He said, you chose to come. That matters. He looked around at each of them. It wasn't a throwaway line. I've been turning it over since he said it, and I couldn't figure out what it meant. He stopped in the center of the room. But what if the real condition, the one Raymond actually cared about, wasn't the sacrifice at all? What if it was the refusal? The room absorbed that. You're saying the test was whether one of us would refuse, Diane said slowly. I'm saying the test was whether all of us would refuse. Marcus looked at Caleb. You figured out the experiment. You brought the truth into this room instead of sitting on it. You could have used that information as leverage, to protect yourself, to redirect suspicion, to bargain with it. He held Caleb's gaze. You didn't. You put it on the table for all of us. Caleb said nothing. That's what he was looking for, Marcus said. Not the person willing to sacrifice someone else. The person willing to sacrifice the advantage. Derek looked between them. So what does that mean practically? Right now, with 6 hours left. Marcus looked at Edmund's closed door at the end of the hall. Then he looked back at his siblings. All 3 of them, the full group of them, standing in the room their father had built, holding the wreckage of a game their father had designed. It means we end it, Marcus said. Together, right now. We walk down that hall and we tell Edmund that we refuse the condition. All 4 of us. Unanimously. And the 42 million? Diane asked. Burns, Marcus said simply. The word sat there. Diane looked at him. For a long time she didn't speak. Then she looked at the fire, at the envelopes on the table, at the glass in her hand that had only water in it now. She thought about her company. 11 employees, 3 weeks of payroll, a building lease she hadn't told anyone about. She set the glass down. Okay, she said. Derek exhaled. A long, slow release, like something that had been compressed in his chest for 3 days finally finding a way out. He nodded once. Okay. Caleb looked at Marcus. Something moved in his expression. Not gratitude exactly. Something quieter and more durable than gratitude. Recognition, maybe. The particular recognition of being seen by someone who didn't have to see you. Okay, Caleb said. Marcus nodded. He turned and walked toward the hallway. The other 3 followed. They walked in a line down the east hallway, past the grandfather clock that had never worked, past the family portraits that only represented half the family, past the locked room that wasn't locked anymore, and Marcus knocked on the study door. A beat. Come in, Edmund said. Marcus opened the door. Edmund was sitting at the desk, jacket back on, briefcase closed beside him. He looked at the 4 of them standing in the doorway, all 4 together, which he hadn't seen since the reading, and his expression did something almost imperceptible. A slight ease, like a man who has been holding a particular posture for a long time and has just been told he can relax. We're refusing the condition, Marcus said. All 4 of us. Unanimously. Whatever the consequence of that is, we accept it. Edmund looked at each of them in turn. His gaze moved from Marcus to Diane to Derek to Caleb, slow and deliberate, the way it always moved. Then he reached into his briefcase. He produced a second document. He set it on the desk. He looked at Marcus. Your father anticipated this outcome, he said. He called it the preferred outcome. The room went very still. Edmund opened the document. This is an addendum to the will, executed simultaneously with the primary document and sealed under separate cover. It was to be opened only in the event that all 4 parties refused the condition unanimously. He looked up, and it states, in your father's words, the following. He read, if my children are reading this, then they chose each other over what I built. That means I failed to raise who I feared I was raising. It means something I never expected to be true is true, that they are better than me. Edmund paused for just a moment before continuing. The $42 million, all associated properties, assets, and holdings are to be distributed equally among all 4 of my children, without condition, effective immediately upon unanimous refusal of the primary clause. Nobody moved. Additionally, Edmund continued, the accounts and holdings transferred in the 18 months prior to my death, currently held under the name of Stuart Reeves as a blind trustee, are to be released in full and added to the estate distribution. The total value, as of last valuation, is $107 million. Derek made a sound. Diane sat down. Not elegantly, not deliberately. She just sat, right there on the edge of Edmund's desk, because her legs made a decision without consulting her. Caleb had both hands pressed over his mouth. Marcus stood completely still in the center of the doorway, and his face did what it had almost never done in his entire disciplined, controlled, carefully managed life. It broke open, just for a moment, just long enough to be real. Then it came back together and he pressed his lips flat, and he looked at the ceiling briefly and he nodded. Edmund set the document down. "Your father also included a final personal note," he said. He looked at them almost gently. "Not addressed to any of you specifically, just to the room." He picked up a small card from the back of the document. The kind of card you'd find in a florist's arrangement. Raymond Caldwell had written his final words on a florist's card. Edmund read it aloud. "I built everything I had by trusting no one. I want to know if you can do better." He set the card down. The clock somewhere in the house ticked. The fire in the sitting room crackled distantly. Outside, through the study window, the sun had finally broken through the cloud cover. Thin and pale and November weak. But there, real. Falling across the desk and the document and the four of them standing in the doorway of a room that had always been locked. Marcus looked at his siblings. At Diane, sitting on the edge of the desk with her hand over her eyes. At Derek, who was standing very straight and very still and blinking more than usual. At Caleb, who had lowered his hands from his face and was looking back at Marcus with an expression that had none of the guardedness of the past 3 days in it. Just open. "Well," Marcus said quietly. He almost smiled. "Turns out he left us something after all." And that was the thing about Raymond Caldwell. He had spent his entire life testing people, measuring them, filing their responses and cataloging their weaknesses and deciding, from a cold and clinical distance, what they were worth. But somewhere, in the last 2 years of his life, in the quiet of a room nobody else had been allowed into, he had done something he had never done before. He had hoped. He had hoped that the children he had failed to love properly would somehow, despite him, become people worth loving. He had built the cruelest possible test he could imagine, the kind that would strip away everything polite and comfortable and performed, and he had put at the center of it a door, a way out, a choice that cost them everything and gave them back more. He had hoped they would find it. They did. Not because they were perfect. Not because the 3 days hadn't cracked something open in each of them that would take a long time to fully close. Not because the things said in that sitting room, the looks exchanged, the names unspoken, the moment when 3 people had looked at a fourth and let him read the calculation in their eyes. Not because any of that had been erased, but because when it mattered, they had chosen each other. And in the end, that was the only inheritance that Raymond Caldwell had ever actually wanted to leave behind. He just hadn't known how to say it any other way. In the end, the greatest inheritance wasn't wealth. It was the choice they made when no one was watching. If the story moved you, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Drop in the comments, what would you have done? Would you have refused?